Imagine the night before your wedding. You are standing in a garden full of white flowers, breathing in their sweet smell, your heart so full of joy you can barely stand still. You have found the one. You are certain. Tomorrow you will be his wife. Then a hand grabs your arm. Not gently. Hard. Like a warning. You turn, and you look into the eyes of a woman dressed in expensive silk, her neck heavy with gold. She is not smiling. She has never smiled at you, not once in the months. She leans close. Her perfume is sharp and cold, like something beautiful that has gone bad. And she whispers for words directly into your ear. Run for your life. That is where our story begins. Not with a wedding, not with joy, but with those 4 words, spoken in the dark, by the one woman in the world you never expected to hear them, from his mother. Grace heard those words on the eve of her wedding to Daniel. She stood in the garden of the big house, the night air warm around her, and she looked at Margaret Daniel's powerful, cold, immaculately dressed mother, and she felt her whole body go still. Margaret said nothing more. She let go of Grace's arm, turned on her heel, and walked back into the house. The yellow lights of the mansion swallowed her whole. Grace stood there alone. The white flowers trembled in a small breeze. Somewhere inside the house there was music and laughter. Daniel's voice, warm and bright, floated out through the open window. She could leave. She could run. Tonight? Before anyone noticed? Or she could stay. Grace looked down at her hands. She thought of everything she had endured to get to this moment. She thought of her grandmother's tears when she first brought Daniel home. She thought of Daniel's eyes, the first time he told her he loved her, how clear they were. How honest. She lifted her chin. She stayed, and that decision. That single, quiet act of courage was the first thread in a story that would unravel everything. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe too, so you never miss a story. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what Grace discovered, you must first understand where she came from. Grace had grown up in a small house at the edge of a dusty town, raised by her grandmother, Nana Ruth, who had strong hands and a gentle heart, and who always smelled of groundnut soup and firewood. Their house had 2 rooms, a leaking roof, and a vegetable patch in the back that kept them fed during hard months. Grace's mother had died when Grace was only 4 years old, a fever that came too fast and left too quietly. And Grace's father, Nana Ruth, would only say one thing whenever Grace asked about him. "He is gone, my child, and it is better not to speak of the gone." So Grace grew up with questions that had no answers. She grew up learning to sew, because Nana Ruth had a sewing machine and said, "Hands that make things will never beg." Grace became good at it, very good. Then, extraordinary. By the time she was 23, she had a small tailoring business in the market, a loyal group of customers, and a reputation for making wedding dresses that made brides cry with happiness when they put them on. She was not rich. She was not even comfortable. But Grace had a kind of dignity that money cannot buy, the kind that is stitched into a person through years of quiet suffering and quiet perseverance. That was how Daniel found her. Daniel was 31 years old, the only son of the late businessman Charles Mensa and his widow, Margaret. He had inherited his father's import company, had doubled its size in 3 years, and drove a black car that the whole street could hear coming from 2 roads away. He was the kind of man people pointed at when they wanted their children to see what success looked like. But Daniel was lonely in the way that only rich people can be lonely, surrounded by people, seen by everyone, truly known by no one. His previous relationships had all collapsed, not because of him, but because every woman who entered his life was really entering his mother's life. And Margaret Mensa had a gift for making people feel unwanted without ever raising her voice. The day Daniel walked into Grace's small stall at the market to ask if she could repair a torn jacket, he was not looking for love. He was in a hurry. He had a meeting in an hour. But Grace looked up from her machine with those steady eyes and said, "This jacket was sewn badly to begin with. The problem is not the tear. The problem is the stitch at the collar. I can fix both." And something in the directness of her words, the simple truth of them, spoken without fear, stopped Daniel in his tracks. He came back the next day, and the day after that, 30 months later, he was in Nana Ruth's small sitting room, asking for Grace's hand. Nana Ruth looked at him for a long time. She looked at his car parked outside. She looked at his shoes. Then she looked at his face. "Does your mother know you are here?" Nana Ruth asked. Daniel hesitated, just a half second. But Grace saw it. "She will know," he said. "Once Grace says yes." That hesitation, Grace had stored it away like a small stone in her pocket. She didn't know then what it meant. She would know soon enough. Engagement was announced. Margaret was told, and from the very first evening Grace was brought to the Mensa family home. The temperature in every room dropped 3 degrees whenever Margaret entered it. Margaret never shouted, never insulted. She was too refined for that. Instead, she used silence like a blade. A pause too long before answering Grace's greeting. A glance at Grace's simple dress that lasted just a moment too long. A habit of speaking to Daniel, as though Grace were not in the room. Level 1 cruelty, invisible to everyone who was not Grace. And then came the night in the garden. The whispered warning. Run for your life. The morning of the wedding arrived like any other morning. Birds, light, the smell of cooking from the kitchen. Grace stood in front of the mirror, in her white dress, the dress she had sewn herself, every stitch placed with love and patience. She looked beautiful. She knew it. But her mind was not in that mirror. It was still in the garden. Still earring. Those 4 words. She had told no one, not Nana Ruth, not Daniel. She had locked the words inside her chest and carried them through the ceremony, through the vows, through the moment Daniel slipped the ring onto a finger and looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world full of pretend things. She had married him anyway, but something had changed. The question was no longer, "Should I marry this man?" The question was now, "What does his mother know that I do not?" The Mensa house was large. 3 floors, 7 bedrooms, staff quarters, a study that stayed locked, and a garden that Grace had only seen at night. As Daniel's wife, she now moved through these rooms freely. She smiled at the staff. She learned their names. She listened. It was Thomas who first made her stop. Thomas was Margaret's driver. He had worked for the Mensa family for over 20 years. He was a quiet man with gray at his temples and a way of looking at the floor whenever Margaret entered a room. On Grace's 3rd day in the house, she was passing the garage when she overheard him speaking on the phone in a low voice. "New wife. She looks just like her mother, exactly like her." "Yes, I am telling you. It is the same face." Grace stopped walking. Her heartbeat changed rhythm. She stood very still behind the wall, her breathing shallow, the smell of motor oil and dust around her. "Margaret will not let this one stay long either," Thomas murmured. "God help that poor child." The phone call ended. Grace heard Thomas walk away. She stood there alone in the shadow, and she felt it, that feeling you get when you step onto a floorboard and it gives just slightly under your foot, warning you there is nothing solid underneath. She looked just like her mother. That was what Thomas said. Grace had grown up without a mother, without a father. Wheat Nana rude, careful silences whenever the past was mentioned. She needed to find out who she was, and why that terrified Margaret. That evening, while Daniel was in his study working late, Grace asked Margaret's housekeeper, a gentle older woman named Abina, if she could see the family photo albums. "I want to know Daniel's history," she said, with a bright smile. "I married him. I should know where he comes from." Abina saw no harm in it. She brought out 3 thick albums from the sitting room shelf. Grace sat down at the dining table and turned the pages slowly. Baby photos of Daniel, wedding photos of Charles and Margaret, holidays, ceremonies, birthdays, and then, near the back of the second album, her hand stopped turning. A photograph, old, slightly faded. Two young women standing together outside a building, arm in arm, both of them laughing. One of them was a young Margaret, easy to recognize, even without the gray hair and the expensive clothes, because the coldness in her eyes was already there, even in a laugh. The other woman made Grace's breath leave her body. She was looking at her own face. The same forehead, the same mouth, the same line of the jaw, 30 years older. Perhaps, but unmistakably, the woman in that photograph was a version of Grace. Grace's hands were shaking when she turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pen, Margaret and Ida, best friends. Grace's mother's name was Ada Sleep. Did not come that night. Grace lay beside Daniel in the dark, listening to his steady breathing, and stared at the ceiling. Her mother, Margaret. Best friends. 1991. The words moved in circles around each other, slow and dangerous, like water, before it becomes a whirlpool. In the morning, she went to find Thomas. She found him polishing the black car in the garage, his back to her, moving the cloth in long, quiet strokes. She walked straight up to him and said, without introduction, "You knew my mother." Thomas went very still. The cloth stopped moving. He did not turn around right away. When he did, his face was the face of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for years and was afraid it had finally come. "Madam Grace," he said carefully. "What are you, Thomas?" Grace kept her voice low and steady. "I am not here to make trouble. I am here because I need to know the truth. I saw the photograph. I know my mother and Margaret were friends. I know you recognized me. Please." She paused. "I grew up without a father. Nana Ruth would never tell me why. I need to know." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the door behind her. Then he looked back at the cloth in his hand and set it slowly on the bonnet of the car. "Your father's name was Joseph Arhin," he said quietly. "He owned a piece of land. Good land. 3 acres. Just outside this town. He and your mother, Ada. They worked that land. It was enough to live on. Enough to build something. Margaret's late husband, Mr. Charles Mensa, wanted that land. It was beside a road he was developing. He offered your father money. Your father said no. That was the beginning of the trouble." Grace did not move. She barely breathed. "Mr. Charles, he found a way. There were papers. I do not know all of it, but documents were signed that your father did not sign. His name was put on things he never agreed to. Margaret, she was the one who understood documents and lawyers. She handled it." Thomas's voice dropped lower. "Your father was accused of fraud. Land fraud. He was taken to court. He lost. He was sent to prison." The courtyard swam in front of Grace's eyes. She pressed her hand flat against the side of the car to steady herself. "My father was in prison," she said. The words felt like stones in her mouth. "Yes, madame. And my mother?" "Your mother died the year after. They say it was fever, but those who knew her, we say it was a broken heart." Thomas looked away. "You were only a small child. Your grandmother took you." Grace stood in the garage for a long time. After Thomas finished speaking, she could hear the birds in the big mango tree overhead. She could feel the warm, rough metal of the car under her palm. She could smell the polish and the dust. Margaret had destroyed her family. And now Grace was living in Margaret's house, eating Margaret's food, sleeping in Margaret's son's bed. She breathed in. She breathed out. She made a decision. She was not going to run. She was going to find every single piece of the truth, and then she was going to make sure Margaret could never hide behind it again. That afternoon, Grace called Nana Ruth. "Nana," she said, when the old woman's voice came on the line, warm and familiar, "I need you to tell me about my father. All of it." Today, there was a long silence on the other end. Then Nana Ruth made a sound half sigh, half something older and heavier than a sigh, and she said, "I always knew this day would come, my child. I prayed it would not, but God does not listen to prayers that protect lies." Nana Ruth told her everything. Joseph Arhin had been a good man, a farmer, a builder, a man who laughed loudly and carried his daughter on his shoulders. He had been friends with Ada since childhood, and they had married young and happily. When Charles Mensa wanted the land and Joseph refused, they thought the matter was settled. They did not know that a refusal to a powerful man was not the end of the conversation. It was only the beginning of the war. The court case took 8 months. Joseph lost everything. The land, the house on it, the savings, the dignity. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Ada fell ill within months. She did not see the end of the 2nd year. "And after his sentence," Grace asked, her voice steady though her hands were shaking. "After prison, where is he, Nana?" Another silence. Longer this time, Nana Ruth. "Where's my father?" "He did not die, Grace." The old woman's voice was barely a whisper. "He was ashamed, broken. He did not come back. There were letters, in the beginning, from a village far away Asamang. Then the letters stopped. I do not know if he is still there. I do not know if he is still." Her voice cracked. "I did not want you to carry this pain, my child. I thought I was protecting you." Grace closed her eyes. "You were, Nana, but the time for protection is finished." That evening, Grace found something that made her stomach drop. She had gone into Daniel's study while he was at a business dinner, looking for any documents that might carry the family name or the land records. She was not snooping with malice. She was searching with purpose. She found, in the bottom drawer of the old oak desk, a folder. Inside the folder were land documents, the original land documents for the 3 acres in Joseph Arhin's name, the ones that had been used against her father, the ones that had supposedly been lost or destroyed in the court proceedings. Te were Ranin. T's house, all along. For one brief, dizzying moment, Grace thought, Daniel is Parth. Of this, everything is a lie. Her hands shook. Her vision blurred. She sat down on the edge of the desk chair and stared at the folder in her lap. Then she turned to the last page. There was a handwritten note, clipped inside the back cover, in Daniel's handwriting. She had seen his handwriting on birthday cards, on notes he left her in the mornings, on the back of receipts when he wrote her small love messages. She knew it immediately. "To know side these belong to someone. When I find out who, I will return them." Grace pressed the note against her chest. She closed her eyes. Daniel did not know. He had found these documents and knew they were wrong. He had held on to them, waiting. He was innocent, but Margaret was not. The next morning, Grace drove herself to the land registry all Isa in town. She had photographed every page of the documents. The clerk, a tired-looking man with ink on his fingers, looked through them for 11 minutes, while Grace sat on a hard wooden chair and waited. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "These are original documents." He said slowly. "They were reported destroyed." "Where did you get these?" "From someone who found them," Grace said carefully. "Can you tell me what they prove?" The clerk turned the pages slowly. "They prove that the transfer of this land was fraudulent. The signature on the transfer is a forgery. The real owner never signed. This was done by somebody with accesto, the right lawyers, and the right stamps." He looked at her over the documents. Somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. Margaret had known exactly what she was doing. She had not just allowed her husband to take the land. She had engineered it. She had forged the documents herself. She had been the one with the legal knowledge, the connections, the cold precision, to dismantle a man's entire life and leave no fingerprints. And she had done it to her best friend's husband, to Ada's family, to Grace's family. The motive was clear now. in all its ugliness. Margaret had resented Ada. Perhaps she had once wanted Charles for herself, before Ada married him. Perhaps she had simply grown jealous of Ada's happiness on that small piece of land, a happiness that had nothing to do with wealth or status, the kind of happiness Margaret, for all her money and power, had never been able to buy. So she had taken it apart, piece by piece, document by document, and she had warned Grace to run not out of guilt, not out of remorse. She had warned Grace to run because Grace's face, Ada's face, was a mirror, and Margaret could not stand looking into it every morning at the breakfast table and seeing what she had done. Grace drove to Asumang that same afternoon. It was 3 hours away, a small village on a red dirt road, with cashew trees and a single church with a rusting roof. She stopped at the first house she saw and asked an old woman sitting outside if she knew a man named Joseph Arhin. The old woman looked at her for a long time. "You look like his daughter," the woman said. Grace could not speak for a moment. "I am his daughter," she finally said. The old woman stood up slowly. "Come," she said. "I will take you." Grace returned to the Mensa house that night with something new in her chest. Not anger alone, though the anger was there, burning steady and clean. Something stronger than anger. Certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when you have looked truth fully in the face and decided you will not look away. She went to Daniel first. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same kitchen where Margaret's cook made the family meals, the same table where they had eaten together every evening, and she told him everything. The photograph, Thomas, Nana Ruth, the land registry. As Daniel listened without interrupting, his face moved through several expressions that Grace watched carefully. Confusion, disbelief, then a deep and spreading grief that settled into his eyes like water soaking into dry ground. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "The documents in my study," he said. "I found them 3 years ago, in a box of my father's old things. I knew they were someone's. I just did not know whose." He looked at Grace. "I am sorry." "You did nothing wrong," Grace said. "My family did." "Yes." Grace reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Now we have to make it right." The next morning, Grace walked into Margaret's sitting room without knocking. Margaret was seated in her usual chair by the window, a cup of tea on the small table beside her, dressed as always in clothes that cost more than most people earned. In a moment, she looked up at Grace's entrance with her usual expression measured, controlled, slightly bored, until she saw what Grace was holding. The folder, the land documents, spread open, every page visible. Margaret's teacup stopped halfway to her lips. "Grace," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "What is this?" "You know what this is," Grace said. She set the documents on the table in front of Margaret. "These belong to my father, Joseph Arhin, the man you helped put in prison, the man whose land you stole, the man whose wife, my mother, your best friend, Ada, died while he was behind bars." Margaret set down her teacup with absolute precision. "You are confused, child." "I am not confused." Grace's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I spoke to Thomas. I spoke to the land registry, or Isa. I drove to Asamang, and I found my father." She paused. "He is alive." "Margaret, you should know that. He is old and thin, and he has been living alone in a village for 20 years, because the shame of what you did to him broke him into pieces. But he is alive." Something moved across Margaret's face. A flicker. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar mask of cold composure. "I don't know what that old driver told you, but do not," Grace said softly, "do not lie to me. Not today." A silence fell over the room, thick and still. The curtains moved in the breeze. From the open window, somewhere in the house, a door closed. Then Margaret did something Grace had not expected. She looked away. Out the window, toward the garden, where she had whispered those 4 words 3 months ago. And for just a moment, beneath all the silk and gold and hardness, Grace saw something else. A woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "I did what was necessary," Margaret said at last. Her voice was quieter now. "Charles wanted that land, and what Charles wanted, primera mave happen, that was my purpose. That was my role. To make things happen for this family, your best friend's husband," Grace said. "Her children, life, Ada made her choices. She chose that man, that land, that small life." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I built something greater." "You built it on a grave," Grace said. "And then? The court will see these documents. The registry has already been notified. The land transfer will be reviewed." "That is not a threat, Margaret. That is simply what comes next." Margaret looked back at her then, and in that long, clear look, something shifted permanently between them. 2 women staring at each other, across a canyon of old crimes and fresh truth. "I warned you to run, Margaret Said," and her voice, for the first time, was not cold. It was tired. "I know," Grace said. "You warned me because you were afraid I would find out. Not because you cared about me." She picked up the documents. "I am glad I did not run." Friends, if this story is moving you, subscribe now to The Ending Will Change How You See Everything. The legal process began within a week. The documents were submitted to the relevant authorities. A retired judge who had handled the original case came forward, saying he had always been troubled by inconsistencies he had not fully pursued. The land registry opened a formal view. A forensic handwriting expert confirmed what Grace had already been told. The signature on the transfer deed was a forgery. Margaret hired lawyers. Of course, tray of them, but documents do not lie the way people do. Ink and paper hold their truth longer than any memory. The Mensa name, which had stood in that town like a great iron gate for 3 decades, began to tremble. Daniel stood beside Grace, through every meeting, every filing, every long evening of paperwork spread across the kitchen table. He did not waver. When his own lawyers suggested a quiet settlement, money paid, names kept out of the press, Daniel looked at them and said, "My wife grew up poor because of what my family did. Money is not justice. The truth is justice. But none of that, not the lawyers, not the documents, not even Margaret's cold, crumbling composure. None of it was the moment that broke Grace open. That moment happened in a small room in a village called Asamang. On the afternoon Grace returned. With Daniel, the room smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. The walls were plain. There was a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a window with no glass. A thin man sat in the chair, looking out at the cashew trees. When the door opened, he turned. He saw Grace. And Grace saw him, really saw him for the first time in her life. She saw her own forehead, her own hands, her own quiet steadiness. The thing she had always thought came from Nana Ruth's teaching, but which had always been in her blood. "Papa," she said. It was the first time she had said that word to a living person. Joseph Arhin looked at his daughter, the daughter he had left behind 22 years ago, out of shame and brokenness, and his face did something that faces only do in moments of grace. It came completely undone. Every year of hardness, every year of silence, every wall he had built, brick by brick, against the pain. It all dissolved. He rose from the chair. His legs were unsteady. Grace crossed the room in 3 steps and held him. She held him for a long time. Daniel stood in the doorway and said nothing, and that was the right thing to do, because some silences are not empty. Some silences are the fullest thing in the world. Outside, the cashew trees stood still in the warm afternoon air. Inside, a family that had been broken for 22 years became, in a single moment, whole. The court ruling came 6 months later. The fraudulent land transfer was Oi Shadi. The 3 acres outside town, long since converted into part of a commercial road, could not be physically returned, but its monetary value, accumulated with 22 years of interest and assessed damages, resulted in a sum that Nana Ruth, when she heard it, sat down and could not stand up again for a full minute. The formal judgment named Margaret Mensa as the architect of the original fraud. Charles Mensa, long dead, unable to face consequences, was named as the beneficiary. The family estate was ordered to pay restitution. Margaret did not go to prison. She was 70 years old, and her lawyers argued age and poor health. With some success, but she lost something that, for a woman like Margaret, was worse than prison. She lost her name, to Mensa Name, the name she had spent 50 years building and polishing and placing on buildings and charitable donations, became, in that town, associated with fraud, with forgery, with the deliberate destruction of a poor man's life. People who had once smiled at Margaret in church now found other places to look. Invitations stopped arriving. The phone grew quiet. Margaret sat in her house by her window, and the garden outside was the same garden where she had whispered those for words to Grace, and the flowers were still white, and the nights were still warm. But she sat alone in it now. 1 year passed. Nana Ruth moved into a proper house, 3 bedrooms, a real roof, a kitchen with a gas stove that she touched every morning, as though she could not quite believe it was real. She grew tomatoes in the back garden, and on Sunday afternoons Grace came with Daniel, and they ate together at a table large enough for all of them, including Joseph, who had come to live in the town again, slowly, quietly, rebuilding himself. The way a man rebuilds after a long storm, one solid thing at a time. Joseph did not speak much about the lost years, but he laughed. And his laugh, Grace discovered, was exactly like her own. The same rhythm, thesum, warmth, the same way of starting low and rising suddenly. Nana Ruth would watch them laugh together and wipe her eyes with the corner of her cloth, pretending it was the onions. Grace's tailoring business did not close when she married Daniel. She moved it into a proper shop in town with a painted sign and 2 young women she was training. She still sewed every dress herself. At first, the brides still cried when they put them on. Some things do not change with money. Daniel became a different kind of man, not a lesser man, but a cleaner one. He had grown up in a house full of secrets, in a family where success was purchased rather than earned, where power was wielded without thought, for the cost paid by others. He had not known, but not knowing had not made the harm smaller. He understood that now, and understanding it changed the way he used the power he had inherited. He began funding legal aid for people caught in land disputes. The quiet, grinding, invisible kind of injustice that happens in dusty courtrooms while powerful people tap their pens and the poor sit on hard benches and hope. It was not a grand gesture. It was not announced. It was simply what he chose to do with what he had. As for Margaret, she came to Grace 6 months after the judgment, on a Tuesday morning. No phone call before, no appointment. Just a knock at the door of the new house Grace and Daniel had built together, smaller than the Mensa mansion, but warmer, with wood floors and open windows and a smell of baking and clean air. Grace opened the door. Margaret stood there, without her gold, without her silk, in a plain blue dress, her gray hair in a simple knot, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked like a woman who had finally put down something very heavy and was not sure what to do with her empty hands. She did not ask to come in. She said, "I am sorry, Grace, for what I did to your family, for what I said to Ada." "For what?" "I was," she swallowed. "I cannot undo it. I know that. But I am sorry." Grace looked at this woman who had whispered, "Run for your life," in the dark, who had destroyed her father, who had let her grow up in want while living in wealth, and she felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness. Not yet. That would take time, and perhaps it would never come fully, and that was allowed. But she felt something quieter than anger, something that was almost not peace, but the beginning of peace. "I hear you, Margaret," Grace said. She did not say, "It is fine." She did not say, "I forgive you." She said, "I hear you." And she meant it, every word. She closed the door gently. That evening, Grace sat on the porch of her new home as the sun went down. Daniel was inside, the sound of his voice on the phone mixing. With the clatter of Nana Ruth cooking, from somewhere down the road came Joseph's laugh. That rising, sudden laugh, that was her laugh too. The air was warm. The sky was the color of ripe mango, orange and gold at the edges, and dark blue at the top, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Grace thought about the night in the garden, 3 years ago. The cold hand on her arm, the 4 whispered words, "Run for your life." She had stayed instead. She had looked the darkness straight in the eye and walked toward it rather than away from it. And on the other side of that darkness, through all the documents and courtrooms and drives, on red dirt roads, and a thin man in a wooden chair, turning to see her face for the first time on the other side, was this: a father's laugh, grandmother's cooking, a husband's voice, a life made whole. She closed her eyes. She breathed in the warm evening air. The woman who had been told to run had instead run toward the truth, and the truth, as it always does, given enough courage, and then time had set her free. Thank you, dear friends, for joining us on this journey today. Remember, the things that frighten us most are often the things we most need to face. Grace did not run, and because she stayed, the truth came out. Justice was served, and a family broken by greed was made whole again. If this story moved your heart, please subscribe to and click the bell so you never miss a story. And watch our next story right here. It is waiting for you, and we promise it will stay with you long after it ends. Until next time, friends, take care of each other.